Well, dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to this online seminar of the Illiberalism Studies Program at the George Washington University. My name is Marlies. I'm the director of the program and of the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. And we are here to open a new series of online seminars devoted to the publication last year of the Routledge Handbook of Illiberalism, which had about 60 chapters. So a really impressive compilation of chapters discussing many different aspects of the terminology of illiberalism and of course all the terms related to it, going from populism to authoritarianism to far right and so on. And we have decided to do that in partnership, of course, with the editors of the Routledge Handbook of Illiberalism and to invite contributors, chapters contributors, to come and join us in a seminar to briefly present their research so we can kind of spread the word about the Routledge Handbook and have the discussion going on. So we have today for this first seminar, three great colleagues who will be presenting the chapter they have been written. I was proposing to present for pretty short, like 10 minutes each of you, so we will still have half an hour for the discussion. Let me say a few words about our speakers today. We will first have Marlies Glasius, who is Professor of International Relations at the Department of Politics at the University of Amsterdam. She works on authoritarianism, global civil society, and she's currently working on a book titled Authoritarian Practices in a Global Age, so unfortunately a very timely topic. Then we will have Stephen Feldstein, who is Senior Fellow at Carnegie Democracy, Conflict and Governance Program, where he focuses on issues of democracy and technologies. And he published last year, The Rise of Digital Repression, How Technology is Reshaping Power, Politics and Resistance. And then we will have Nausic Palazzo, who is Assistant Professor in Constitutional Law at the Nova School of Law in Lisbon, where she works on the area of family laws, constitutional laws, and sexual politics. So thank you, all of you, so much for making it today for this first seminar devoted to this Routledge Handbook of Illiberalism. And I give you the floor. Maybe Marlies, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. I have focused my contribution on illiberal practices, and I will give you my definition of what they are. Then I will explain with some examples why it's important to focus on practices, what it shows us, and then I will say a little bit about the relationship and the distinction I make between illiberal practices and authoritarian practices. So an illiberal practice for me is a pattern of actions embedded in an organized context, infringing on the autonomy and dignity of the person. That includes interference with legal equality before the law, recognition before the law, freedom of expression, fair trial rights, freedom of religion, freedom of organization, the right to privacy, and violations of physical integrity rights. I make a distinction between illiberal practices, infringing on the autonomy and dignity of the person, and authoritarian practices, which are patterns of sabotaging accountability to a forum over whom a political actor has some power. They very often coincide, and I'll get back to why I think the distinction is useful. Why practices? Well, practices focus on the routine rather than on the spectacular, on actions as opposed to discourse. Discourse is also important, but it's also important to study actions on their own. And they're carried out by configurations of actors rather than we assume there is one person, one man usually at the top who is orchestrating everything that happens in a state. A first example is deportation of migrants without papers. It infringes on the autonomy and dignity of individuals, often without access to an independent court, without due process or the possibility of appeal. Focusing on the US, they have a long history, starting in the 1930s, the number of deportations, and I think that's important for understanding practices, was actually higher under President Obama than under Trump, notwithstanding all the rhetoric. And President Biden wants to do something about it, but we can see here the stickiness of practices. Once you have an institution like ICE devoted to deportations, it becomes difficult. And many law enforcement officials within and outside ICE really believe in the necessity of deportations for the good of the nation. It's not just a United States phenomenon. In Europe too, it's become increasingly institutionalized since the 1990s. And there too, you can see deportations carried out just as vigorously, but also by governments without any element of the far right or populism in it. So what this example shows is that some illiberal practices are entrenched in liberal democracies, and they're not just a recent phenomenon, and they don't have to be associated with populism. My second example is transnational, an example of transnational diffusion of illiberal practices, namely legal restrictions against NGOs. They have been on the rise in all regions, in authoritarian and hybrid regimes, but to a lesser extent also in full democracies since 1999. And when I started doing this research, we actually put a database together, me and two co-authors. I expected that it might be an exemplary effect of Russia and China. I also looked for a possible 9/11 effect, terrorism, Arab Spring, and we found none of that. We just found a steady rise of the number of legal restrictions against NGOs year on year. And it was primarily a regional issue. What we found, it was routine copying by civil servants of bits and pieces of laws from neighboring countries that they deemed useful in order to restrict NGOs. Provisions that on the face of it were more bureaucratic than repressive, but they can be used selectively against NGOs that are a nuisance. For instance, in 2009, Uganda set up a national regulatory body for NGOs with representatives from a number of ministries that can easily withdraw licenses, both for the entire NGO or for specific activities. And within a year, within months, neighboring Ethiopia had a similar board. And then in the next few years, Zambia, Rwanda, and Kenya followed. And I found a similar example in the Middle East, where Egypt was the leader and other regional countries followed. A few words on the distinction between illiberal practices and authoritarian practices. As I said, one is to do with individual autonomy and dignity, and the other sabotaging accountability. I find it useful to prize them apart, even though they often go together, to see how those connections work. So illiberal practice sometimes precede and prepare the way for de-democratization. It's a mechanism of fear. And in the paper, I give the example of the anti-drug policies of Duterte in the Philippines. I think also the anti-LGBTQ policies of Putin, which were widely popular, was something that then preceded other forms of de-democratization. And it reminds me of that famous poem, "First They Came for the Communists." So that's one way it can work, the relation between illiberal and authoritarian practices. In liberal democracies, I think you have another mechanism where illiberal practices that happen secretly, and thinking, for instance, about the rendition program by the CIA and the associated torture. There is something to hide there. They recognize it's shameful, and that then causes subsequent accountability sabotage, authoritarian policies of secrecy and lying, both in the United States and in European allies that actually held these secret prisons in order to hide the scandal. So coming to a conclusion, there are there can be a connection between illiberal practices and populism, but it's not always so. Some illiberal practices are entrenched in liberal democracies, and some are transferred as governance models from one country to another. Even if they do begin with a populist leader, we should not be over-focused on him or her alone. We should also pay attention to the participation and the institutionalization, the law enforcement officials, the ordinary citizens that take part in it in order to fully understand illiberal practices. And let me end with a shameless plug for the book that Marlene mentioned, because it's actually done. This is my book, Authoritarian Practices in a Global Age, which will be available with OUP in February. And I hope to actually come to the US for a little bit of a launch tour. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, we would be delighted to receive you for our launch, for your launch of the book here at GW. Thank you so much for this presentation. I think it was really bringing a lot of key elements into the discussion, both the institutional, the leader, the grassroots aspect, and the fact that you may have parallel illiberal practices happening both in liberal democracy and in illiberal politically liberal context. Steve, I would like to give you the floor now to follow up on your own chapter.
Great, thank you. And let me just echo the interest in having a very nice launch event at the George Washington University. So I look forward to that in person as well. But in the meantime, this is a really nice way to kick off ideas in the book. So in my chapter, I talked about surveillance in the illiberal state. And I've done a lot of research overall when it comes to looking at ways in which new technologies, surveillance strategies, and so forth permeate worldwide. Not only in illiberal contexts, also in authoritarian contexts, as well as more liberal democratic contexts. So this chapter and topic was a good opportunity for me to kind of focus in more precisely on strategies in illiberal democracies and to think more about how they align with and compare to strategies in other types of political contexts. So I think to start with, I wanted to lay out in the chapter a theoretical understanding about what exactly it is we're talking about when it comes to surveillance and its effect politically, and to also describe some of the evolving trends when it comes to how surveillance is changing in the current environment, particularly in the digital environment that we see, and to then look specifically at what those implications are for the use of surveillance in illiberal states, and how that compares to other types of contexts, particularly liberal democracies. So I start with a fairly standard definition of surveillance, which is that surveillance involves methods or systems for monitoring for purposes of intervening in the world. And that surveillance can be used for both legitimate purposes as well as for unlawful ones, ones that have a coercive intent at their end. Now, at its core, I believe surveillance is premised on concepts of power and control. And this goes back to lots of understandings from Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon, to looking at other aspects that researchers have established when it comes to the controlling component to surveillance and how it is used precisely to reinforce and help advance particular coercive objectives. Now, what we have seen, particularly in the post 9/11 era, is what Gary Marks terms the new surveillance. So the new surveillance relies on technical processes to extract or create personal data, and as a result of the higher level and availability of transactional data in which to collect information and then use for particular political purposes. And so within that, I defined 4 particular areas that are of interest from a surveillance perspective. So one of which is that the proliferation of surveillance laws and directives that provide governments with expanded authorities to carry out blanket collections of metadata or communications content. Second are passive surveillance strategies involving diverse communications surveillance instruments that collect, monitor, and intercept data. Third is targeted surveillance techniques. So specific intrusion operations, and this is really relates to spyware in particular, that are used to exploit software data, computer systems, and networks to gain unauthorized access, oftentimes for objectives related to suppressing or targeting or persecuting political dissent. And then finally, the advent of AI, artificial intelligence, and big data surveillance tools, automated techniques powered by advanced algorithms to identify wider behavioral patterns. And we see this being pioneered by countries like China, but that are also being exported to a host of illiberal states, such as Serbia and Uganda. So there is certainly a proliferation, diffusion aspect to that. Now, while surveillance in general has given significant power to coercive power to governments, there is a flip side to surveillance as well. It's the idea of counter surveillance or the notion of watching the watchers. So there has been a growing body of work and analysis being undertaken by different nonprofit organizations, advocacy groups, activists as well, that use the proliferation of open source data or open source intelligence as a means to track, monitor, and hold accountable the very governments who are undertaking human rights violations, committing mass atrocities, and so forth. And so we see this in evidence around the world, whether it is spotlighting evidence of atrocities being committed by the Russian military in Ukraine using open source satellite imagery, or likewise growing calls and concerns about the potential for genocide in Ethiopia as a result of its civil war, again, using mobile phone and videos and satellite imagery and so forth as a way to surveil and watch what those entities are doing. So there is also a sort of counter side to surveillance as well that has empowered individuals and citizens to hold accountable the behavior of a variety of regimes, both authoritarian as well as illiberal as well, in terms of their activities and actions. Now, when it comes to illiberal incentives, there is a very strong linkage that has been made theoretically between illiberal democracies that use their political ideology against an outgroup and their commissioning and promotion of low intensity coercion, which involves less visible but systematic actions to track and repress opponents. So while you might see lower level aspects of repression in illiberal states like the Philippines or like Uganda or like Serbia, in comparison to more closed authoritarian states, this low intensity coercion actually is a very strong facilitator and makes constructive use of surveillance techniques as a way to advance those very objectives. So one of the questions I explored in particular in the chapter is to consider empirically whether there is a greater uptake and adoption by illiberal states versus liberal democracies when it comes to use of surveillance instruments. I used, for my data, I used the Digital Society Project, which is affiliated with the Varieties of Democracy project data related to social media monitoring. Now, from the outset, I recognize that social media monitoring covers one portion of surveillance, but it doesn't necessarily serve as a full proxy for all types of surveillance. So social media monitoring will help you understand behaviorally the interests on surveillance of a given regime, but it doesn't show you a full complement of instruments that are being used, particularly physical surveillance instruments like facial recognition and so forth. So it's not a perfect for that end, but it gives us at least, I think, an insight into what that looks like. And I think when I ran the analysis, one of the interesting things I found was that amongst liberal and illiberal democracies, the rate of usage in terms of the adoption and prevalence of use of these techniques was actually relatively similar. And that was surprising to me. I would have anticipated that illiberal democracies are much greater users of these instruments than liberal democracies. But one thing that I think is important to know is that the variable just measures usage of adoption of these techniques. It doesn't actually measure commensurate violations that occur. And so when you actually then factor that in, you find that there is a much stronger relationship between those countries, using surveillance techniques, and those that also have evidence of commissioning violations of civil liberties, and so forth. So that then gets us to what are sort of some takeaways that we can get from how surveillance is unfolding in the world. And so I list three sort of main ideas for consideration in the chapter. So first, state surveillance measures allow agents to monitor and track specific individuals in a much greater fashion than we've seen previously, who represent political threats to the regime. And I talk a little bit about the continued use of spyware and its correlation to, particularly from an abusive perspective, to illiberal states. And just recently, we've seen continued scandals in countries like Mexico, India, Pakistan, and a host of others, many of which, again, have elements of both democracies as well as authoritarian characteristics. Second, mass surveillance strategies are helping governments keep tabs over large swaths of their population in order to preempt political protests. And while, as I mentioned, this is something that has been pioneered by the Chinese government, we are also seeing its usage in other illiberal states, such as in Serbia, in Belgrade, where the government has entered into a partnership with a Chinese company, Huawei, to establish a facial recognition system, and has even featured joint patrolling between Chinese police agents and Serbian police. And so that shows you some of the convergence that's happening in this area. And then finally, in addition to supporting coercive objectives, surveillance tools can also help illiberal regimes advance proactive co-option and manipulation strategies. So in a sense, I look to the Philippines as a good example of this, where in the Philippines, primarily the tool of repression that has been used has been information manipulation, both by Duterte, the previous president, and the new President Marcos. And in that sense, information manipulation is most effective when a government is able to undertake extensive social media monitoring to understand the preferences, to understand better what types of information will lead to more of a political reaction and will help to flood out and take away from the messaging of opposition members. And so as part of the disinformation strategy, collecting enough information in order to help make that disinformation strategy more potent has been a key role played by surveillance within the Philippines. So why don't I stop here? There's a lot more to talk about when it comes to surveillance in the liberal state. And I look forward to a robust discussion and Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I think that was a really great summary of the key intersection between what is the disinformation, what is the more technological, almost technical process of controlling also the messaging and the different aspects of surveillance in really different contexts. And I think what you were saying about the data that you found and the fact that surveillance tools are also used in liberal system, not for exactly the same way, but as illiberals is really fascinating results. Let's now move to Nausic, who will be shifting us to what is probably the core glue ideologically used by liberal regimes and politicians, which relates to kind of the gender aspect of traditions and so on that have been really key and very often articulated to exactly what you were saying about previously about both kind of illiberal institution and disinformation. Nausic, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the lovely invitation. I also very much endorse the idea of having an in-person event in the future. I think I would prefer to share some slides, so please let me know if you can see it. Yeah. Okay. So as Marlene was saying, our chapter was basically what happens when illiberals appropriate conservative, progressive, and gender norms, right? And therefore curb the rights of sexual minorities like women and LGBTQ rights. So I take this opportunity today to talk about this research and also talk about a spin-off of this research that focuses a bit more on specifically the role of religion within illiberalism when it clashes with the rights of sexual minorities. And I try to understand this role by looking at three very different perspectives: a feminist strand of scholarship that's, of course, highlighting this clash between religion and progressive gender and sexual orientation norms, and it's calling for more state intervention into the private sphere to eradicate illiberal practices. And then we have a strand within politology of religion, particularly exemplified by the work of Illiberal, that's giving us a different perspective, that of organized religion, particularly the Catholic Church. And then a third strand of critical social and legal studies, particularly queer theory, that's trying to sort of give us both perspectives, even collapse dichotomy between religion on the one side and the rights of sexual minorities on the other side. So our chapters basically is trying to understand what role religion can have in promoting, of course, more conservative laws and policies in the area of the rights of LGBTQ populations and women. And we noticed in particular, me and my co-author, Susanna Mancini, that religion can either provide more passively a sort of repertoire of conservative values, conservative doctrines that liberals can appropriate to curb the rights of sexual minorities. And we have so many examples in that regard. For instance, coming from Hungary, where Orban was trying to provide himself a definition of illiberalism. He would tell us that by that, it refers to family and, of course, an heterosexual understanding of family, but also Christian culture, namely that sort of common culture that liberals are no longer trying to protect and to uphold, and then anti-immigration. Or another very paradigmatic example is that of the Catholic Church, which is since the 19 actually promoting alternative knowledge, trying to resist this sort of denaturalizing understandings of gender, sex, of family, and uphold more, let's say, conservative notions drawn from biology and anthropology, like what Pope Francis calls an anthropological understanding of the family that's based on the complementarity of the man and the woman, and on the mission to procreate, as actually Pope Francis said yesterday, reiterated again that's the only possible understanding of family. And then we have a second type of support that religion can provide to liberal regimes, which is active in the sense that we have seen that in some instances the church is taking a more sort of active role in endorsing illiberal agendas and illiberal reforms. And I think that the experience of the Russian Orthodox Church is very emblematic in that regard, also because it has reached new peaks of intensity and visibility lately when the Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill, endorsed the aggression, the war to Ukraine, saying that it's rightly trying to prevent these manifestations of the evil, like gay parades, from leading societies to the apocalypse. So we can see that it's now acquiring more sort of eschatological tones, trying to distinguish between good and evil, light and darkness, pointing to the sort of self-destruction of societies that are sort of upholding these more progressive gender norms. And the experience of Russia is also interesting in another sense, and particularly because the church is trying to actually promote a counter-revolution, and it's trying to, in human rights, and it's trying to replace what it calls individualistic Western legalism, meaning this paradigm of human rights that's taken the individual as the axiological starting point, with an alternative paradigm that is more communitarian. So I thought I would mention this experience because it's again trying to do something else, which is promote a counter narrative in the field of human rights that upholds a different conception of human rights, what they call the Russian legal tradition. So what are these three views that I identified in my research? So first of all, how do a specific strand of feminism tries to make sense of what's happening? Feminist scholars tend to start from the premise that we have, of course, a clash between religious freedom on the one side and the rights of LGBTQ populations and women on the other side. And even the very, emergence of feminism is cast as a story of emancipation from religion and the patriarchal norms of religion. The critique that's most visible within this trend of scholarship is a critique to the private-public distinction that I'm sure you're familiar with, because they point to the inability of political liberalism to remedy the root causes of women's subordination by relying on this private-public distinction that's basically only shielded illiberal practices that were occurring in the private sphere. So I look at the work of Gila Stokler, famous Israeli feminist, that in a recent special issue is taking this perspective and basically saying, look, illiberal regimes like Poland and Hungary are now basically taking these values, these liberal values that we allow them to have in the private sphere and bringing them back in the public sphere. And they are removing the only barriers that political liberalism had erected in their paths towards majoritarianism and authoritarianism, and therefore she calls for more pronounced state intervention to the private sphere to eradicate these illiberal practices, including illiberal religious practices. So the first perspective is clear. We have religion that shouldn't have, especially in its more illiberal version, flourished in the private sphere. Then we have the perspective of Olivier Roy, which is also taking for granted that there is a clash between what he calls secularism, so more progressive gender also, and sexual orientation norms on the one side, and of course religion on the other side. And he gives us a very interesting view. First of all, starting to note that it's true that there is a sociological trend of secularization, meaning a sharp decline in religious practice. But then how do we explain that still many people identify as Christians? So he, of course, refers to this trend of culturalization of religion, to the fact that religion is becoming a mere cultural reference, and it's becoming identity without faith, without belonging, pure folklore, he says. And based on this premise, he theorizes this hijack view in the book, Saving the People, saying that actually religion is a victim of liberalism. So not only is it possible, but also necessary for religious denominations to take a distance, to contract out of illiberals' appropriation of religion. And as an example, he gives Matteo Salvini, Italian, a former vice prime minister, who was using the cross routinely within his electoral campaign to present himself as a true representative of Christianity. And on that occasion, the church said that that's not religion and took a distance from Salvini's behavior. And then we have a third perspective that's, I call it postmodern, we could call it the Kreitz perspective, that's collapsing dichotomies, a lot of dichotomies actually. A first one being public-private distinction, and we know that many theories, many queer thinkers are talking about the last stages of the decline of this distinction, but also the very dichotomy between religion and gender, meaning religious freedom and LGBTQ and women's rights. And here I take as my starting point the work of Italian sociologist Alberto Giorgi, which basically says, look, this dichotomy is imperfect and needs to be collapsed because there is a lot of intra and inter-religious variety. So what are we even talking about when we talk about a specific religious organization? We have so many movements, strands within religions, some progressive, some conservatives, that the dichotomy doesn't hold. And also we have post-secularism that's telling us that religion is now able to take a seat at the table and be the source of values that inform public discourse, with the consequence that religion is no longer a problem when we try to promote new reforms. Think about religious feminisms, and particularly Islamic feminisms, where thanks to post-secularism, women have no longer to renounce their religious stance to be active also in the public arena and promote their values. And then we have this third point, non-conventional alliances, that's based on a edited collection that I recently published that's pointing to the potential alliances between non-traditional religious groups and queer groups in family law. Just think about Mormon polygamy and also polyamory. That's also trying to, again, collapse the dichotomy. Time's up, right? I'm done.
Yeah.
The very last point, the last dichotomy that's being collapsed is the dichotomy between illiberalism and religion. And here, Giorgi rejects the hijack view. So she's basically saying, look, when Salvini is using the cross, is authentic. That's actually religion, because there are many trends in religions like individualization, culturalization, fragmentation of religious authority that point to the fact that religion is actually out there. And in my view, this is a little bit problematic because I'm not sure it erects sufficient barriers against the appropriation of religion by liberals for their own agendas. So thank you very much for having me. I also look very much forward to the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nausica, for this really comprehensive overview of these really critical questions. There are several questions arriving in the chat. Maybe I can ask one question for each of you.
Did we lose Marlene?
I think we might have.
Yeah, I thought it was me, but it's her.
Well, in that case, while we wait for Marlene to come back, Stephen, perhaps I can ask another question to you. You mentioned the powerful use of OSINT strategies to keep in check or monitor violations of authoritarian states. How effective have these tools been in actually checking the violations, given that ultimately it's a question of whether the international community is willing to react and respond to these violations? And in the meantime, the state can kind of continue to repress its own population.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I think like anything, the answer is mixed. I mean, it's certainly fair to say, to what extent are there deeper problems and fissures in the international community that make it difficult to provide the type of accountability people would look for when it comes to actions undertaken, by different regimes that violate human rights. Sadly, we live in a world right now where we have an increase in war and violence, and the underlying fact, the growth of OSINT isn't going to change the actions of Russia when it comes to conducting a campaign that targets civilians, and that's directly in violation of the Geneva Convention. So fair. That being said, I would argue that the presence and the ability of citizen investigators, of Bellingcat, of Amnesty International Tech, forensic architecture, and others to collect data and either to help use that to inform war crimes trials that are currently taking place in the Ukraine, or to lay the groundwork for future accountability, or even from a political perspective, to help shine a light and expose the actions of different actors who have engaged in violations, such as assassination attempts, like the Skripal poisoning that that Russian agents have carried out, that have, thanks to Bellingcat's work, been exposed worldwide. I think all that is important. I think all of that has helped to at least allow for a measure of accountability in a fairly grim environment. And so to that end, I think the question isn't necessarily right to say, is it changing the overall human rights environment? I think the question is it making a marginal difference? Is it allowing for specific levels of accountability when it comes to the actions undertaken by governments with impunity that otherwise have few levers for forcing transparency in terms of what they're doing? That's how I would sort of address or think about that question.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Sorry if I disappeared for 1 minute. There was internet connection issues. Do we have a question from the room? Because I have question coming on the chat, but I'm also happy to give the floor to people in the room. If you would just raise your virtual hand, I'm happy to give you the floor. If not, I can continue asking the question we got in the chat. And then, in fact, for both our two speakers, Marlies, there was a question about the kind of the birth of kind of illiberal solidarity at the international level, and how do you consider, in especially probably your book on this authoritarianism in the global age, the kind of construction of, so how would you react to the notion of an illiberal world order emerging, or at least solidarity and kind of extraterritoriality of illiberal practices by some states? That was one question. And then indirectly linked to that, but still, Nausica, there was also a question about the kind of the transnational aspect of the gender movement, and how much do you think that these transnational actors are playing a key role in kind of spreading narratives and techniques? Or do you think really that the homegrown context is the key element, but how do we articulate what is happening at the national level domestically and the role of these kind of transnational actors? Yes, I give you the floor back. Marlies, would you like? Yes.
Yes, I think we may be overly alarmist and simplistic if we think there is one stable illiberal coalition, and even more so that it's based on some sort of solidarity. I think that's the wrong word. I think what we see is very transient coalitions, sometimes based on shared ideologies and sometimes on shared interests. The shared interest ones, I think, are much more under the surface, much more quiet, many more corporate interests involved there, for instance, as opposed to the ideological ones. But I do think it is worthwhile to think of these, as transient, as fragile, as open to fissure. And I think that's also where, for us, some of the interest and the hope lies. Nausic just made brief reference to the Orthodox Church in Russia. You see Orthodox churches, and of course, most of you know much more about that than I do, all over the world, kind of tearing themselves apart over the war in Ukraine. Certainly not one unified voice, no illiberal solidarity there. Let me leave it at that.
Thank you. Nausica, give you the floor back.
So the transnational aspect, I think this is actually crucial. We don't have to be naive. These people, there are more and more groups that are taking action at the transnational level, especially if we think of what I was mentioning before, this idea that we should promote a counter revolution in the field of human rights. And this, of course, requires action that's been taken not simply at the domestic level, like Putin's been doing in Russia or Orbán is trying to do in Russia, but it's also very much about geopolitics and geopolitical influence. So we have a twofold action that from states like Russia that are trying to influence this sort of communitarian understanding of human rights globally through their resources, financial and influence, and also a lot of movements that are trying to do that. I was just reading this very famous democracy report by the Open Society of 2019 that sort of traces all these flood of money that are coming from US conservative movements, Christian movements to Europe to fund all these campaigns in the field of abortion, against same-sex couples' rights. Abortion is also an excellent example because we see through this transnational pro-life activism that's occurring both within the courtroom with groups that are backing each other, right, by either through third-party interventions or by providing legal material for them to act through so-called lawfare, or more informally by training people that are conducting strategic litigation. So long story short, I think that this is an enormously important field of research because it's particularly relevant.
Yes.
I could
Marlies.
just very briefly add on to that. I would say we had it coming. I think progressive civil society was maybe 20 years ahead in becoming so good at networking and knowledge sharing and so on and so forth, dominated the United Nations for a long time. But, you know, the conservatives were at some point going to catch up. So we should be less surprised that we should have been doing the research earlier.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yes, Steve.
Yeah, just one point. My colleague at Carnegie Endowment, Richard Youngs, has done a lot of research looking at what he calls conservative civil society and its spread globally, and looks at a lot of these kind of issues. And I think, you know, it's exactly right that there's no reason that just because, you know, liberal civil society has experienced that success in prior years, that this wouldn't be emulated in different directions by groups that have a very different perspective when it comes to these kind of core political issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even at the level of civil society kind of techniques, but also at the level of more kind of, you know, subculture activism, you see a lot of borrowing, right, between from the conservative side of the progressive side. So that's a great point. I have a next round of question, but as I said, I welcome also direct intervention if some people want to ask question. Yeah, Agbota, a question from our PhD student. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentations and for the panel. So I had a question, actually kind of two questions to mostly Stephen and Professor Glasius. So on the first one about this like democratic coalition or like the international community that's pushing back against authoritarian practices, how should we conceptualize who the actual actors are? Because I think there is a tendency to think about these actors as like, well, yes, there are democracies, there are autocracies. Democracies are clearly the good guys, and but it's not like what is it, like it's not a dummy variable, right? It's like it's a gradient, it's a spectrum, and countries fluctuate from one to another from year to year. So like under Trump administration, maybe the US wasn't as democratic and wasn't like as reliable of a partner in this pushback against authoritarian practices in the digital space or otherwise. So who are the actors? And then second, related to the distinction between authoritarian regimes versus authoritarian practices, so when we look at new digital like initiatives or like surveillance initiatives, we assume that France is not going to use it for authoritarian purposes, whereas like China is obviously doing this to consolidate decrease accountability and like consolidate the grip of power. Is that like assumption always like are there potential pitfalls of that assumption? Thank you.
Thank you, Agota.
Should I take a shot? Okay, sure. Great questions. First of all, thank you so much. Let me, and you know, I agree and have argued fairly extensively, you know, the very points that you've made. So let me elaborate on both of them. I'll start with the second one, you know, in terms of liberal democracies and whether there are also abuses that are rife within those systems, and how do you distinguish between, you know, what's happening in democracy versus a country, authoritarian state like China. And I would say that I don't see much of a gray area when it comes to deeply authoritarian states, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and liberal democracies. I think that the comparisons are too stark, and the practices that we know and that we've been able to measure empirically are widely divergent. And so no matter how much we see a democratic breakdown in France, foreseeably, it's not going to be anything close to what we see in a closed authoritarian system. That being said, there's a lot of gray areas, and certainly there are abuses that have occurred and will continue to occur in a range of liberal democracies and weaker democracies as well. And some of them, like India, which is sort of on a sort of downward trajectory democratically, you can really ask some very you know, troubling questions about where it'll go. What I would say very briefly about liberal democracies is that while abuses do occur, and while we should be vigilant and concerned about how technology is being used, it's the ability for self-correction. It's a system institutionally that is designed to allow for accountability, where you have a transparent, relatively regulatory process where civil society groups can operate and help hold accountable these abuses. It's that aspect that I think gives resilience to democracies in a way that you don't see in either hybrid or closed authoritarianism. So that would be my state. So that would be my kind of answer to the second question. Quickly on the first one, you know, I think the idea of a kind of uniform democratic pushback, you know, to authoritarian behavior is much more rhetoric than reality. I do think under the Biden administration, there have been some ways in which the U.S. and other liberal democracies have tried to come together and to kind of use from a multilateral perspective, push back on certain aspects that they find concerning on the digital side. So there's been, for example, a grouping that has tried to push back on internet shutdowns. There's been a declaration for free internet that 60 countries have signed. So there are these sort of multilateral, high-level, you know, pronouncements, at least under the current U.S. administration, that I think is helping to kind of stem or push back against authoritarian uses. But I would note a couple things. So I think, you know, one, the allies that the United States and other liberal democracies work with don't always have the best practices. I talked about India before, but you know, the India is both in the Quad with the U.S. and it also is a purveyor of some of the most concerning digital repression trends that we see. And so in that sense, there isn't a clean line between democracies pushing back against the actions of certain states, especially when geopolitics is involved. I think, you know, the other aspect as well, when it comes to, you know, democracies and their pushback is that, you know, there is a China question and then there is a digital authoritarianism question. And sometimes those get conflated in the sense that when you see US policymakers saying, we want to stop the proliferation of Chinese technology, it can be sometimes unclear whether the interest underlying that is because those technologies are inherently anti-democratic or because those technologies represent a strategic rival to the United States and so therefore are a threat geopolitically to US interests. And I think that will continue to be a little bit of a gray area when it comes to US policy in this issue.
Wonderful. Marlies, would you like to add?
Yeah, maybe just briefly on the second question, taking it from a European perspective, I'm very skeptical, even cynical of the notion of there being a pushback against authoritarianism. I think foreign human rights policy in the last 20, 30 years has very much taken a backseat. It's been very business first. Only recently, I think, does there begin to be a recognition that authoritarianism can actually be a threat to our own societies. Sometimes that takes on demonizing aspects. I also think we now see in the Ukraine crisis that it can sometimes practically actually be very difficult to take good measures. We're supposedly freezing the assets of the oligarchs, but it turns out to be really difficult to figure out who the Putin supporting oligarchs are and who are not, and how and whether you can actually freeze their assets. I've recently seen calls similarly to sanction Iranian intelligence law enforcement officials. Great idea on paper and much better than blanket boycotts that actually hurt the Iranian population. But again, difficult to do it in practice. When you do see these initiatives, even human rights rhetoric, invariably it comes from a very strong civil society demand for it, a domestic civil society demand, kind of backed up often by diaspora people. But pushback, I don't think so, unfortunately.
Thank you so much. There were other questions for the two of you also on the role of corporate and the private sector in what is happening now. But maybe as we just have a few minutes left, I wanted to have a question for Nausic. There was a question about the, you had one of your slides showing the, I mean, one of the way of framing the issue being that religion is getting hijacked by liberal sources, and that we could imagine, and in some cases it's happened, to have religious actors kind of reacting against the hijacked and fighting for another vision of religion. And so the question is about, in that case, what does that tell us about what maybe sometimes the gap, sometimes the overlap between conservative values and illiberal as a political practice? So can we imagine the conservative values without the liberal practices, and should we be dissociating the two terms and consider that there may be a revival of conservative value that is not automatically connected to illiberal practices?
Yeah, that's a very hard and excellent question. Thank you for putting it to the table. I think I would just tell you what Olivier Roy would say in that regard, which I think it's very interesting. So from the perspective of the Catholic Church, basically, we could reframe the question, is this an opportunity or not for the Catholic Church to have its finally the role that has always dreamt of, like to have a more pronounced role as the national culture, right? The so-called Christian roots of Europe, should they be embedded and grafted into law, for instance? And from the perspective of Olivier Roy, this is a clear no, because the Catholic Church is a different creature, is a creature that has more universalistic aspirations, doesn't want to be limited, bound to a specific ethnicity or national boundaries, and also it doesn't share many of the values that are upheld by illiberals, like the anti-Islam is much less pronounced within the Catholic Church. So in a sense, the agenda is also different. But I think this is a very hard question. I don't have an answer myself, because it might be tempting to think that now it's the moment, right, to engraft into law what, for instance, the Pope calls the non-negotiable moral issues, no? This decade-long battle that they're been doing actually to transform into law more conservative values. So I think it's an open question, to be honest.
Wonderful. Well, I think it's a good way to conclude our seminar by saying that many of the things we are discussing are kind of open question, and that both things are unfolding very fast around us, and research is also getting produced. So I think there are many kind of good discussion going on now about the way we are ourselves as analysts thinking and conceptualizing what is happening around us. So I wanted to thank the three of you and all our attendees today for launching this first seminar around the Routledge Handbook of Illiberalism. Thank you so much for your contribution. We will have a next seminar on December 1st with 3 or 4 other of your colleagues, and we will be going like that over once a month for all the academic year, and we really hope that will become a nice place for kind of discussing the research that has been really like very currently timely produced. So thanks again to our 3 great speakers for raising so many important questions with so many nuances, and I hope to see you very soon in some of our other seminars. Thank you all.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.